Hey everyone, welcome to session 78 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Boy, do I have a great conversation to share with you today. Dr. Barry McCurdy joins me, and we talk all about school mental health and PBIS. And towards the end of the conversation, we also dive into a topic that is of great interest to many practitioners, and that's the topic of supporting individuals with trauma backgrounds. So you'll want to stick around for the whole conversation. But before we get to that, I want to take care of a few quick housekeeping items. If you're in New England on April 19th, the New Hampshire ABA is hosting Dr. Solange Forte, and she's presenting on navigating through cultural barriers in applied behavior analysis. It will count for 3 hours of Type 2 ethics CEUs. So if you're able to check this out, go to nhaba.net/events, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. If you're looking for some online continuing ed, however, Behavior University has some great deals going right now. In the spirit of March Madness, they are offering a discount on all seats for live webinars sold in March. So only $20 will get you up close and personal with leaders in the field like Matt Broadhead, Jonathan Tarbox, Joe Lucian, and others. The sale ends on March 31st, 2019, so grab those seats before they're gone. For more information, go to behavioruniversity.com/observations. All right, last thing, the book that Dr. Lisa Britton and I have been working on over the past year and a half will be out next month, and we're really excited to share it with everyone. It's called Remote Fieldwork Supervision for BCBA Trainees. It's available at a couple different places like Amazon, and it'll be at the ABA bookstore, but the best price is at the Elsevier website, which I'll link to in this episode. So, all right, thanks for bearing with me. That's it for these introductory announcements. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation I had with Dr. Barry McCurdy.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Barry McCurdy, thanks for coming on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing fine. This is one of those shows where you throw out a call for questions and you just get deluged, and that we did today. So, boy, we're going to talk about all things school psychology, PBIS, maybe throwing a little bit of trauma talk in there. A very, very popular topic, and perhaps a topic that requires some explanation, or at least some conceptualization about how we should think about that as behavior analysts. So, Barry, I'm really very much looking forward to this.
Good. I'm looking forward to it as well. And again, thank you for inviting me to join you today. I appreciate it.
The pleasure's mine. So, let's first talk about. I guess my first question is, what is it that you do? And then secondly, kind of like, how did you kind of get into this line of work? What was your, kind of first contact with behavior analysis? And you can answer those questions in, I guess, in any order you wish.
All right. So quickly, what I do is I direct the Center for Effective Schools, the Devereaux Center for Effective Schools. So I've been doing that for a number of years. And we are a training and consulting and a little bit of research kind of organization housed within Devereaux's Institute of Clinical and Professional Training and Research. But I'll just back up a little bit and talk about getting into behavior analysis, because that is kind of an interesting story. So back in 1980, I was working as a counselor in an urban school, in an urban high school, and then a little bit later in an urban middle school. And I had been trained in counseling psychology. And I thought, that was great. My career is set. I'm going to love this. Had a great job. And then after a while, kind of saw that wasn't able to make much change, wasn't able to have much impact. Liked working with kids. Kids would come and talk to me. But, in an urban environment, there are all kinds of issues going on, and I really didn't feel like I was able to address those. My wife at the time, she was a special educator, and I kept saying, hey, I think I want to go back to school. And she said, well, what are you thinking about doing? And I wasn't sure. She said, well, maybe you ought to think about school psychology. looked at that a little bit and decided, yeah, maybe that's what I'll do. And so in the area where I lived, I had two options. One was a small state school, and kind of inexpensive, and that's where I had intended to go. And another one was Lehigh University, which was much more expensive, private school, and much more expensive. And so I applied to both, but my intention was really to go to the state school. And in fact, I had already taken a couple courses at the state school. Kind of liked them. That was great. And I was on my way to becoming a traditional school psychologist. So in a traditional school psychologist role, you come into the school, you get referrals, you test kids, meet with multidisciplinary teams, kids get placed into special education. This is 1980. That's what was happening at the time. So I did apply to both schools, got an interview at the state school, and then they called me from Lehigh University for an interview, and I didn't call them back, and I kind of left them on hold a little bit. They called back again. Maybe they called a third time and said, look, are you coming? You got to make a decision. I said, okay, that's fine. So I ended up with two interviews, one at each school, both on the same day. One was at 11 o'clock, and those schools are about 2 hours apart, and one was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Get up that day and go to the interview at Lehigh University, and was in there sitting, and no one was greeting me, or they told me where to go for the interview, but that was about it. And then a guy came out of the door and said, who are you? What are you here for? I told him my name, and I said, I'm here for an interview. And he looked at his timesheet, and he said, well, you're not due here until 2 o'clock. So I accidentally mixed up the referral times, right? But that person happened to be Ed Shapiro, who was running the school psychology program, and was a brand new professor there, and was brought in to really energize the school psychology program. And what he was doing was bringing in a behavioral model of school psychology, which in 1980 was a very different model of school psychology at the time. And he said, in fact, that he wasn't due to interview me, but he just happened to be there and saw me sitting there. And he said, well, I'll just interview you now. You were supposed to interview with someone else later in the day. And what he laid out was just a great vision for school psychology, school psychologists as interventionists, not as people involved in testing and placing kids. I mean, there will always be some of that, but really school psychology as an intervention model. Training school psychologists in behavioral psychology and having them consult and work with teachers to work with kids. And I was blown away by the interview, blown away by his vision at the time. I ended up going to the other interview at another time. I had to cancel that one because I missed it, but ended up going to Lehigh anyway. I mean, just the model there was just great. And when I got in there, I was able to work with some very cool people, including Ed Shapiro, but also Ed Lentz. A lot of people don't know Ed Lentz, but he's a great behaviorist. He was at Lehigh for a number of years and then went on to the University of Cincinnati in school psychology. I got an opportunity to work with Bud Mace. I don't know if you know Bud. Very translational guy too, right? A lot of stuff crossing between JAB and Java and elsewhere. Yeah, right.
A lot of work on ADHD.
Yeah, right. I had an opportunity to work with him, with Christine Cole, who is still at Lehigh University, and with Diane Browder, who is at UNC right now. And Ed Lentz was really my major professor at the time. And he was involved in Project FollowThrough. So, Matt, I don't know if you know Project FollowThrough.
It sounds familiar.
Okay, so it was a big project back in 1967.
Yeah. Go on.
Right. It was it was funded in the Lyndon Johnson era, and to help make gains for those kids that were involved in Head Start. So Project FollowThrough really targeted kids that were in first grade, second grade, third grade, I think maybe even up to fourth grade. And there were 22 different models in Project FollowThrough that they were looking at to serve and to teach disadvantaged youth to help them develop better academic skills in reading and math, et cetera. And there were two models that really stood out. So Project FollowThrough is kind of controversial, so I like to talk about it. There were
isn't that where a lot of the direct instruction research came out of?
That's where it came out of, right?
Yeah.
That's where it started. So Sig Engelman had one of the models at the University of Oregon. And then there was the behavior analysis model, and that was out of the University of Kansas. And I think that involved Don Bushell, who was at University of Kansas at the time. And those two models actually were the two models that had the best outcomes, the direct instruction model and the behavior analysis model. And the controversy comes in that they didn't publish that information. They wouldn't put that information out there. There was a lot of pushback from the other organizations that were involved in the Project FollowThrough, the other universities, and the other publishing companies that were involved in Project FollowThrough. So it's kind of controversial, and you can read about it online, actually, and there's a great book that's sold at the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies, sold through their website, called Project FollowThrough, a case study in contingencies influencing instructional practice and the educational establishment. So if you get a chance to read that, it's a great book.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting.
Yeah. So that's really how I got into behavior analysis. I mean, I was surrounded by behavioral people. I was in a behavioral school psychology program at the time. Ed was brought in to kind of revise the program, and it was a great experience. So I ended up there getting an EDS, education specialist degree, and then from there went to work as their staff psychologist at Centennial School. Centennial School is part of Lehigh University. It's their laboratory school, where we train teachers and we train school psychologists to work with kids with behavior disorders and work with children and adolescents with autism. So I was there for about 8 years after getting that EDS degree. And also while I was there, I went on to get my doctorate in school psychology.
Very cool. Now, we have a lot of younger practitioners and students of behavior analysis listening to the program. I'd like you to talk a little bit about perhaps, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but talk about how rare behavior analysis was as a commodity or as a technology at that point in time. Can you speak to that a little bit? I always love to infuse a little bit of history into these conversations where it's appropriate.
Right. I mean, it was great because I was working, as I mentioned, I was working in urban school. I wasn't having much. I mean, it was great. It was nice. I wasn't having that much success. Kids were great to work with. Teachers were fine. But didn't feel like I was having any impact. Knew I needed more behavioral training. That's sort of what I was seeking. Didn't know where to get it. Just happened onto Lehigh. So as I said, this was 1980. Lehigh was creating this behavioral model of school psychology. Nobody in the country was doing that. And in fact, Ed Shapiro and Ed Lentz would go to present at conferences on the model, and no one would show up to their sessions. And they would talk about that, how they'd be in there, but nobody would come to their sessions. So it was really rare at the time that people were being trained that way. That's what I know about it. Things are very different now. And in fact, there's a lot of behavioral training going on in many school psychology programs now.
So what does the Center for Effective Schools do?
So Center for Effective Schools actually, we are a consulting and training program. So we work with public schools. We work with alternative schools. We work with residential programs. Our focus is really on children and adolescents with emotional behavior disorders. Okay, so that's the focus. I have about 13 staff here. I started with just 2 staff. And our focus really, way back from the very beginning, was on urban schools. Because I'm going to talk a little bit about my background and how I got to Devereux within this, because I think it's important to talk about in order to understand the Center for Effective Schools. So after I was at Centennial School, I went and finished my doctorate degree. I applied to Devereux for a position, and I was the clinical director in one of their residential programs. In one of their large residential programs. And I did that for about 3 years and then decided that I really missed the research aspect of being at Centennial School and being at Lehigh. And there was an opening in Devereux's Institute of Clinical and Professional Training and Research for someone to come in. There was a grant and someone had to come in and develop a training program for all of the direct care staff within Devereux. And Devereux is a large organization, so we're across 13 different states. So I thought, all right, well, I think I can do this. With my experience at Centennial School, I know a fair amount about training staff. As I mentioned, it was a training program for teachers. So I thought I could probably do this. So I went in, took the position as a research psychologist within the Institute of Clinical and Professional Training and Research. Developed the training program after a couple of years. And then in about, I guess I finished that training program in about 1996 and started to look around for where else I could do some work within Devereux, given that I was in their research department. So I started doing some training in a large urban school district. My interest area is children and youth with emotional behavior disorders. Of course, my interest area is in school psychology, so I started working in a large urban school district, doing some work, doing some consulting, and that kind of grew into what we have today as the Center for Effective Schools, that we just were able to grow that model. So the Center for Effective Schools, the mission really is to build capacity in schools and other organizations to serve this population of youth, which tend to be pretty difficult to serve. So it's children and adolescents with emotional and behavior disorders. And we do that right now by doing a lot of prevention work in public, charter, and private schools. So when I say prevention work, we're doing school-wide positive behavior support. We're consulting with schools around school-wide positive behavior support, doing school-based parent management training, doing class-wide positive behavior intervention and support. We also do this work in alternative settings, so alternative school, school-wide positive behavior support, and also in residential programs. And then we also, those models have kind of evolved now, and we're doing some work around school-based mental health, building on that school-wide positive behavior support model. We also consult with schools around special ed systems, around their special ed systems, particularly those systems serving kids with emotional and behavior disorders. And then we do some continuing education and product development.
Wow, that's quite the the charge there of responsibility.
Right. It just builds. It started small, but it is really built.
What I think might be helpful is to maybe take a minute to tackle some of these terms. We talked about PBIS, school-wide positive behavioral supports, parent management training, MTS. In other words, there's a litany of acronyms here.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that might be helpful is just to start kind of like distinguishing what's what, and are there terms that are used interchangeably that that we should be aware of, just so we don't inadvertently confuse the listener, because I know there's so many of these. It's an alphabet soup of sorts, and both this field also and many others, of course.
Sure, that's good. Is there any place you want me to start?
Yeah, so I guess what would be the because I hear the term multi-tiered systems of support. Is that interchangeable with school-wide positive behavior support, and which is interchangeable with PBIS, et cetera, et cetera?
So we're great at coming up with all these terms, all these acronyms. We're really good at it, but we do have to be careful. So let me start. Yes, multi-tiered systems of support is a more current name for school-wide positive behavior support, and also for response to intervention. A lot of times we think about school-wide positive behavior support as a tiered model for addressing problem behavior in your school. We typically have 3 tiers. There can be more, there can be fewer, but it's typically 3 tiers. We have a universal support system to support all students. We have a targeted support system to support some students that continue to have problem behavior. And we have a more intensive system of support for those kids with really chronic problem behavior. So that's school-wide positive behavior support, also known as a multi-tiered system of support. In RTI, response to intervention, now we're dealing with academics, but we have the same approach. What is the core curriculum? What is the supplemental curriculum or targeted curriculum for kids that are continue to have some academic problems? And then what about intensive supports? So it mirrors that school-wide positive behavior support system. Again, you can put both of those together and you can have both those operating in a school. We call it a multi-tiered system of support. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah. So MTSS is kind of like the combination of RTI and a school-wide PBS.
Right. That's where I like to
an
think
umbrella
about it.
term, if you will, for those two things running concurrently.
Good.
Got it. All right. That's helpful.
Hey there, in case you missed it at the beginning, I just wanted to pop into this conversation real quick and remind you that Behavior University has some awesome deals going on right now. $20 will get you up close and personal with leaders in the field like Matt Broadhead, Jonathan Tarbox, and others. This is good for the month of March 2019. So grab those seats before they're gone. Go to behavioruniversity.com/observations and then click on webinars and you'll be good to go.
So I've got some just general questions about these sorts of things. And then I've got, as I alluded to earlier, a bunch of questions about trauma, which is very much in the forefront of everyone's minds these days. So, but let's talk about PBIS first, or school-wide positive behavior supports. So my understanding of it, and I've seen it done in schools in varying levels of success, that there's, generally some sort of universal intervention where you teach people to adhere to a predefined set of values, if you will, usually respect, responsibility, or safety, or some variation thereof. And then you define what that looks like in different settings within the school and different routines and whatnot. And then you provide some general reinforcement around that. I guess one of the things, and that's obviously the tier 1, and we can talk about tier 2 and 3 momentarily. But what, as far as that tier 1 model, that's obviously something everyone's got to kind of get on board with. Can you talk about how to get people excited about it? How, I'm trying to resist the word sales, but how do you sell people on it? And what groundwork do you need to lay in order to, and how long that might take in order to undertake something like this? Because like I said, I've seen schools do these things with varying levels of success, but to be honest with you, I've seen schools be more unsuccessful than successful at times, and so I understand. So there is some response effort involved, and so I guess, and this is kind of echoing a lot of questions that were written in by listeners. So can you talk about, just before we get to the nitty gritty of what this intervention is, what some of the implementation rollout challenges might be?
Sure. Yeah, these are good questions. In fact, you can write a whole book about this. In fact, there probably has been a whole book written about it, actually.
I'm willing to bet,
yeah, there's a lot of PBIS going on, and we just refer to it as PBIS at this point. So typically, and let me just say that we've been doing this work since 1999. We had one of the first demonstrations of PBIS in an urban school. And that's where we like to do this work. We like to do this work in urban schools. They're tough. They're challenging places to get this stuff off the ground. But when we go into a school, and when we go into an urban school, and we have people there that are they don't buy anything at face value when you're in an urban school. I mean, they know where they're sort of where the rubber meets the road, and if you're not there with them, then they're not going to buy into it. So you've got to go in. I guess it's typically how you're going in, what is funding you to go in. So if you're going in with a grant to do some work there, to get this work done, you need to convince them that this might be a good model for them to adopt in this school. In order to do that, you're going to talk about discipline. And really what it's about is kind of getting their discipline act together, getting them more organized around how to address discipline. That's the way we approach it. And we don't usually have any pushback. I mean, teachers they're willing to say, yeah, we need a different way here. We need a different way to do these things. So if you're bringing this in and you can help us get a little more organized, we'll be on board with you. Now, not everybody's on board and not everyone buys in all the time. But, again, the more people you have on board, the better it's going to be. When I first started doing this work in the school, the very first urban school that we did this work in, I really had some people that were not on board, and they were very vocal about it. And it was my job to kind of keep them informed about what we're doing and try to get them bought in as we moved along. Generally speaking, if you have most people on board with you, you can move forward with that model. What we used to do is if we had some grant dollars and we were going in to do this as part of a grant, maybe a demonstration grant, or we were going to try to get some data out of this in the early days when we were doing more research around this work, is we would explain what we're doing, and then we'd actually take a vote to see if they were interested in having us come in or not, kind of just ask them to just indicate yes or no, and it's sort of a secret ballot vote. And if we had about 80% of the staff saying, yeah, come on in, then we would go into the school and begin this process. I differentiate grants from contracts. If a school is calling us and they want this, and we find that more now than in the early days. In the early days when we were doing this work, schools didn't know what this was. And we had grant dollars, and we were trying to go into the schools and do this work to see what was going to happen. In those days, we had to do a lot more talking it up. Today, we'll have schools that will call us and say, hey, we want to bring this model in. And we're willing to pay to have your folks come in and help us do this. And so it's much easier then. But we still go in and talk to all the faculty about this and say, this is what's going to happen. This is what you're going to have to do. This is going to be your responsibility to do this. We'll work with you in doing it, but there's going to be some work involved. And are you interested? So.
It sounds, if I'm hearing you correctly, sounds like buy-in's a little bit easier to come by these days as schools are trying to get a handle on some of these issues that they're dealing with.
It really is. In Pennsylvania, we have an initiative. It's the Community of Practice for School-Based Behavioral Health. And their first initiative is to put school-wide positive behavior support across all the schools in Pennsylvania. And they've been doing it for a couple of years now, and they've got a pretty good start. And they're also working with Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and they're keeping data on all of this. And so we're looking at outcomes at the end of every year. But yeah, it's a nice initiative.
Very cool. One of the things that I'm curious about is, the extent to which this has been demonstrated in rural areas. As we were chatting before we started recording here, I live in rural New Hampshire and do a lot of work in rural New Hampshire and Vermont. We have these notions of New England being this, kind of picture postcard, situation, but there's a lot of very, very down on their luck towns, in my neck of the woods that are rife with, addiction, poverty, disability. Right. It's like the nexus of those three factors, and it creates, all these challenges for these kids. But, other than those challenges might be different than perhaps what might be faced in an urban setting, but boy, is it difficult.
We do know that, actually. It's interesting that you bring that up. I was just in a meeting yesterday, so I have I'm part of a research team that includes Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP, and I work with some folks there who are in the ADHD Center for ADHD. And we've had several research projects across the year, always involving school-wide positive behavior support, and and from their end, always involving mental health interventions. So kind of combining those two. And we've been talking for the last year about the fact that this is great to do this work in an urban area and certainly in a suburban area. But what about these rural schools? No one's getting to these rural schools. And one of the things that I didn't talk about in kind of making this happen, one of the important elements in making this happen is that you've got to have trainers who are able to do this, to train schools, to train school teams. And more than that, you can't just stop with trainers. You've got to have coaches. You've got to have people that can go out, and once the school has kicked off a school-wide PBIS implementation, they're going to need coaching as they go along. And coaching means going into their leadership team and helping them to make decisions and helping them to use the data from Swiss and helping them to find out, what's not working, what is working. So coaches really kind of help this thing keep to continue on. And we don't have that in rural settings. We don't have people that are out there doing that. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to do a remote consultation. We've been trying to get that funded. We did submit a grant last year to the Institute of Education Sciences to see if we could do a remote training and coaching. And then, of course, we would use that for rural schools. Unfortunately, it didn't get selected for funding, which so often happens. We just had a little more discussion about that yesterday as, why are we not resubmitting this? So I'm hoping that we will resubmit it. I think it's a real need.
Yeah, definitely. Something a need we see a lot in some of the schools that I was referring to earlier. I've seen this. I think that probably is one of the challenges they face. They go and get the training and whatnot, and the extent to which someone is there with at least some level of frequency coaching them is an open question. So.
Right. I mean, I want to just mention that for a minute too, because you're correct in that there are a lot of schools that do school-wide positive behavior support. There are a lot of schools that do school-wide positive behavior support that are not connected to any outside consultant to do the training and to do the coaching, but they're saying that they're doing it. And what we find is those are the schools that are usually not doing it very well. I mean, if you're going to do this well, you need to get connected to people who are doing the training, and that might be at the university. That could be us. In Pennsylvania, they have a training and technical assistance network who also does this training. But you need trainers and you need coaches in order to help you to really do this with some level of fidelity.
Let me ask you this. Should it be obvious when you walk into a school that they're doing something like this when it's running correctly?
I think it should be obvious. I think you should see signs all over the place of it. You should see certainly posters with those expectations, and those expectations are important. Those are expectations that we have for the school, but those help to define what the rules are. And posters, if those are around, they should be highlighting those expectations, and they serve as prompts to teach those expectations to kids. So you'll see that kind of thing going on. You may see evidence of some kind of reward system going on in the school. We'll see schools with walls of fame where kids that are doing really well might have their picture on the wall or some information about them on the wall. You'll see those kinds of things going on to get kids excited. And of course, I'm talking about at the elementary level.
Yeah, I ask that because sometimes I'll be in a school consulting, and they're like, "Oh, well, we run PBIS," and I'm like, "Okay, I probably should have known that by I should have been able to discern that by now." And sometimes right. Yes, and sometimes no. Right. Yeah. So, what is the role of one of the questions that just kind of occurred to me, I see a lot is, and again, especially in some of these smaller schools, where you have some number of kids within, say, a specific grade that have a repertoire of challenging behaviors. What is the tipping point from your perspective and your experience to where you go to an administration and say, look, we need to create a
an alternative classroom for these kiddos with emotional behavioral challenges, and then kind of staff it up appropriately. In a lot of the little schools I work at, that we try to support the kids in the classroom as best as possible. They blow out for whatever reason, and certainly we try to do all the function-based treatments and things like that. But it's it's still sometimes a challenge. Sometimes the things that set them off are we can't necessarily address in the classroom setting, et cetera. What has been your experience with some signs that it might be the right time to put a program like that together?
Well, so that's kind of interesting. I don't know that we typically look at it that way. We do work with, like I have a project right now, which is a pretty large project in an urban school in which we are addressing kids with emotional behavior disorders, kids identified for special education and because of problem behavior, and so we're consulting with their classrooms, but their need is actually to help these kids become successful and certainly get them out into regular education classrooms. So we're sort of helping them to do that. I don't know that we've ever gone to a district and said, you need to think about creating this separate program or separate school or separate program within your school to serve these kids. I mean, I think if you don't do that well, there's some risk of grouping those kids together because they actually can get worse. The behavior can get worse if they're not with a great instructor. I think our approach more often is because we do a lot of work with teachers directly and consulting directly in the classroom. Our approach tends to be more, let's see if we can strengthen what's going on in the classroom here. Let's see if we can strengthen what this teacher is doing to kind of minimize the problem behavior. So getting back to school-wide positive behavior support, if we can for just a minute, I want to say that while we do school-wide positive behavior support, and as I said, hundreds of other schools around the country, thousands of other schools actually around the country also say that they do it. You're doing it well, I think, if you've got good training, if you've got good coaching, if you're using data in the way you should be using data, using the team-initiated problem-solving model to look at data from Swiss. And then even then, what we find is that that's not enough to address the issues that occur in the classroom with some of the kids that you're talking about. And so very often we have to go into the classroom, down to the classroom level, and really coach at that level. And I like to say that we're using an OPM approach at that level because we're in there watching the teachers, observing them, and then giving them feedback, typically graphic feedback. We've kind of got it down to an approach where we use a tool that we've developed called the Devereux Classroom Observation Tool, in which we have very specific practices, evidence-based practices that teachers should be implementing in their classroom to really minimize problem behavior. And so we use that tool, go into the classrooms, and then give teachers feedback, and actually have had some really nice experience in seeing teacher behavior change and problem behavior in the classroom reduce. So that's sort of how we go about our work.
I see. Okay. Very good. All right. So let's, I've been kind of dipping into some of the listener questions already, just with some of some of these issues just kind of came up in conversation. I'd like to dip into a couple a little bit more specifically. So let's see. Susanna, who writes in from Scotland, says, what is the role of early screening, detection, prevention, intervention, et cetera, for problem behaviors in public school settings?
Okay, great question, and that's related to exactly what we just talked about, actually. So we do some universal screening in our schools, but because we work this is what happens if you do universal screening in urban schools. Everybody comes up as high risk, okay? So we've had some projects in which we do universal screening we have one project right now in which we are doing a universal screening approach. Screening all of the students in this a K-8 school to look for risk for problem behavior. Now, the thing is that if you're going to do that kind of screening, that kind of mental health screening, you also need to be able to provide services for those kids that screen high or screened at risk. And so right now we're using the SABRS, the Social, Academic, and Emotional Behavior Risk Screener. There are other screeners that you can use, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. There's something that just screens for kids with problem behavior called the Student Risk Screening Scale. But we're using the SABRS right now in this project. And certainly the first time that we used it, exactly what we thought would happen happened. All of the kids in this K-8 school came up very high and in need of services. They would be considered at risk. What we had to do then is figure, all right, why is this happening? It's happening because these kids are engaging in some problem behavior, probably in these classrooms that are not very well managed by teachers who haven't, had a lot of experience in teaching this population of kids, or maybe have not adopted the practices that are effective to teach this population of students in these environments, in these urban environments. And so our first response to that was to go in and do, again, teacher observation and teacher coaching, using our DCOT and using performance feedback to the teacher in the form of we can actually graph their performance to see how they're doing and show them how they're doing. And we've seen some improvements in teacher behavior. And as a result of that, actually, when we screened the second time, we saw some nice reduction in kids coming out as at risk on the screener.
What would be some of those keys to classroom management that you would train teachers on? Are there some low-hanging fruit that our listeners can use when they're out and about in schools and trying to help teachers?
Yeah, we actually this one was a surprise to me. One of my other staff members here, and she just reminded me of this again this morning. She likes to use a lesson agenda, something called a lesson agenda now. And, when she first started talking about this, I said, I don't understand what that is. She said, teachers have to get organized around their lesson. They have to say, this is what's going to happen during this time, during this lesson. Here are all the things that we're going to do, and post that so kids can see that that's happening. We actually used that one time in the classroom, and just that alone, we got the teacher to create her lesson agenda for each of her lessons, and we saw a nice reduction in problem behavior. Now, I don't know that would happen very often in a lot of the classrooms that we work in, but this happened in an alternative school. So what that forced the teacher to do is to think about how she was going to do her lesson, how she was going to structure her lesson for the day, and it just I think it made the teacher a little more structured with what she's doing, and she was better able to manage the classroom. So certainly something like that's pretty low-hanging fruit. But to have that posted in the classroom so that the kids can see and so that the teacher can refer to it. Here's where we're at in the lesson, and when we finish up, then we're going to go for a break, or we're going to go out for recess or whatever. So that's low-hanging fruit. Praise looms out there as one of the best behavior management tools that we have, behavior-specific praise, and teachers don't use it very often. Some teachers do. Some teachers are really good at using it. For some teachers, it's a natural, but for others, it's not. Opportunities to respond, creating a lesson where kids are actively engaged. This is the direct instruction stuff. Getting kids actively engaged, creating opportunities for them to respond, choral responding and individual responding, and fast-paced within a fast-paced lesson. So all those are good evidence-based practices. Having good routines in the classroom. helping teachers to define what those routines are and kind of sticking to those routines. Active supervision, moving around the classroom, not staying in one location, moving around, and using praise. Sometimes that gets referred to as with itness, having a teacher that is with it as opposed to not with it. Kids will talk about that. With itness means that you're kind of moving through the classroom, you see what's going on, you're interacting with kids, you're using praise to identify those behaviors that you want to see, and help other kids who are engaging in other behaviors to kind of come on board.
Great.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I want to go back to the opportunities to respond a little bit, because I know I've done a little bit of reading on this, and I just want to make sure for the listener benefit that I think the rest of the stuff is pretty self-explanatory. So opportunities to respond. It's been a while since I looked at this literature, so feel free to correct me, but it's basically making sure that all students are responding frequently within a given amount of time, rather than going for lengthy periods of time without having to respond, and not having single student responding, but having all students either respond at once, or hold up a whiteboard or response card or some such equivalent. Is that basically
that's exactly what it is? It's frequent opportunities to respond. So you're really engaging them in an active. What it does is it forces teachers to create these active lessons to make sure that they're interacting with kids, that kids are following them along. And you can use a whiteboard. Kids can write the answer on a whiteboard and hold the whiteboard up. You can use choral responding. You can just point at kids and ask for the response from individual kids. And again, that's something that we use when we teach, even when we teach expectations in school-wide positive behavior support, when we're teaching kids what the expectations are. We use choral responding.
One of the things I will ask teachers to do is to kind of punctuate the end of not every sentence, but many of them with the prompt everybody. So they were, what's the capital of New Hampshire? Concord.
Right.
Everyone? Concord.
Exactly.
It does take. It's sometimes it's hard to get someone to get into the habit of doing that, especially when they've got so much reinforcement history for kind of business as usual, if you will.
Right. That comes right out of the direct instruction approach. All that responding.
So I'm going to ask you to speculate here, and why one of the things that strikes me is that I work with veteran and new teachers alike, and their training in this area of behavior management is next to nothing.
You got it.
And what training they have is oftentimes not really evidence-based. Right. Or not nearly as evidence-based as we'd like it. Do you have any sense as to why that's the case? Why the state of behavior management training in our ed programs is the way it is?
So I'm going to go back to our teacher training programs. I mean, there's been surveys that have been done of educators, but in particular, special educators. I'm going to talk a little bit about special educators. Asking them, have you had a class in behavior management? No class in behavior management. Sometimes some of that information will be infused in some of their other classrooms, but in very rare cases do special educators really get trained in behavior management, and regular educators not at all, because it's really about instruction for them. It's all about scaffolding and helping them to improve their knowledge of instruction. And not so much on behavior management. But behavior management is important, as we know, and has to be infused with that good instruction.
Another, I think, while we're perhaps lamenting the state of teacher prep, is that I would also add as a need that I see a lot, especially as you mentioned the special ed level, is that is personnel management, or OPM. A case manager oftentimes is in the position of managing, a half a dozen or so paraprofessionals, but has zilch nada training in how to manage people, and it sets the occasion for all sorts of performance challenges and drama, etc. So that's another one. I suppose we could put on our wish list for the reform of teacher training. So
I would love to see more OBM procedures being used in schools. I think we've had a lot of success in just using performance feedback, just that approach with teachers to really improve their behavior. And we've taught other people in the schools to do this. But there's so much pressure against in schools against giving teachers performance feedback. We've got to make sure that it's not evaluative, that it's not going on to their evaluation, that the principals are not getting that information. Schools could be so much better if we actually took an OBM approach within the schools, I think.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, there's a new book that's coming out by some previous guests called Deliberate Coaching. Paul Gavoni and Nick Weatherly it should be coming out pretty soon. I think they're doing a lot of work in that area.
Right.
So hopefully that's one step in the right direction. So, all right. So let's get back to some more tactical questions here. How does, let's see, Susan writes in, how does the PBIS approach frame up non-compliance? Meaning, what examples of replacement behaviors do you suggest, and how do you resolve the issue of the problem behavior? The word non-compliance is fraught with all sorts of challenges, doesn't pass the dead man test, et cetera, et cetera. But that oftentimes is a what teachers complain about the most, with students. They don't do what I want them to do when I ask them to do it, or they're defiant or what have you, and they use all these kind of other, perhaps less operationally defined terms. Does that fall into the respectful or type of paradigm that of some of those common PBIS values, or how do you guys deal with that in the most general sense, and also kind of more on a tactical level?
So, we'll, certainly in schools we see non-compliant behavior, kids not following directions, not following through. That does fall under, so when we talk about school-wide PBIS, we typically have 3 to 5, and I actually prefer 3, larger expectations. And then those expectations are sort of operationalized across settings. So those expectations are too broad to really teach to kids. And they're typically, be respectful, be ready, be responsible, that kind of stuff. They sound nice. It's great to use those in schools. And it helps kids kind of remember what's important and what the rules are. But the rules are actually different, and they may be different by setting. And so being responsible may include the rule of follow directions first time. Or if you're in the cafeteria, clean up after yourself and throw your food away. Those kind of very specific rules. And so that's what those larger expectations are designed to do. They're designed to help kids remember what the rules might be in that particular setting. And what teachers have to do is kind of teach those rules within that setting so that we can make sure that kids know those rules. Following directions is a good rule, and very often shows up on that teaching matrix that we might have, which combines the larger expectations across settings. If you're working in an emotional support classroom, follow directions also becomes very important because it's one of those rules that we can, if kids are following directions, generally they're doing okay. So that's how we try to get at non-compliance, is just making sure that kids are following directions. So we want to be really clear about that.
Got it.
I don't know if I answered your question on that.
No, I think that was perfectly fine. All right. So Sarah writes in, she says, I'm really looking forward to this podcast. I would love to know if Barry has any experience using PBIS outside of school settings, such as group homes, residential facilities, inpatient facilities, and so on. If so, is the evidence of success commensurate with the school-based programs?
Yeah, we actually have. I've been doing some work over the last 6 years and trying to get PBIS installed in all Devereaux residential programs across the country. That's been quite a project.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been quite a project, and it's really interesting. And I have a bunch of colleagues that are working with me on this as well. We actually have 3 adaptations of PBIS. One adaptation for programs serving children and adolescents with emotional behavior disorders, and these are largely kids with disruptive behavior disorders. This is Devereaux's largest population. We have another adaptation of PBIS in programs serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then we have a third adaptation in some of our programs serving kids with autism spectrum disorders, ASD. And so those adaptations, I call them adaptations because they're all PBIS. They all are slightly different to serve the population. It's been really an interesting project because we did the first implementation of PBIS in a residential program in Georgia, serving kids with disruptive behavior disorders. And we had some nice outcomes there in that first demonstration. Then we took that, moved it across some of our other programs. Remember, we're going across 13 different states. So rather than fly to these states, we had to do some of that training remotely and the coaching remotely. We are still in the process of rolling this out. In some of our programs, we have a great deal of success. I actually will tell you that in our ASD programs, it's been very successful. The model looks very different. It's really about teacher behavior and residential direct care staff behavior. And in our IDD programs, it's the same. We have a fair amount of success in our programs serving IDD individuals with IDD. And then in our program serving children and adolescents with disruptive behavior disorders, we have more variability in terms of success. Some of the programs are doing pretty well, but some of the other programs need a fair amount of coaching. We're just starting to address that now, what needs to happen next. So that's been good. We've also done it in alternative schools. And alternative schools, because they're very similar to schools, that works out pretty well. You just have to do some things a little differently, do a little more teaching, create motivation systems that are a little more intensive, look at whatever consequences you're using to address problem behavior, make sure that they're effective, that kind of stuff. So it works out pretty well in alternative education. We haven't done it in treatment foster care. We've done some other work in treatment foster care that has elements of positive behavior support in it, but we haven't done PBIS in treatment foster care.
I see. All right, good. That'll be helpful. Sarah, she works with I think she works with adults in the community. So
actually, there's at the Association for Positive Behavior Support, as a matter of fact, there will be a whole strand of presentations at the upcoming conference in February for adults with developmental disabilities and positive behavior support.
Very nice. All right, cool. I've got a ton more questions on PBIS, but I think we've kind of I don't want to. I want to get to the T word a little bit here. Is there anything else about PBIS you want to say before we kind of? And I know that we'll probably I'm sure they kind of blend at a certain point, so it's not like we're leaving it permanently. But any other concluding thought before we move on to this next topic?
No, the only thing I want to say is that doing PBIS is not just about having posters and rewarding kids, recognizing kids for the behaviors you want to see. There's data involved, and a lot of schools, I think, are not utilizing the best methods for capturing that data and for utilizing that data. We do a training on team-initiated problem-solving tips. It's benefited from 2 randomized controlled trials. It's really a way to train leadership teams in schools to come together on a monthly meeting and look at their data and make decisions and improve their program, improve their school-wide PBIS implementation. That is the critical element of school-wide positive behavior support. And while a lot of schools say they're doing school-wide positive behavior support, they're not doing that. And that's probably the most important part.
Got it.
It's formative evaluation.
All right. So let's talk about trauma. And I use the T word. I'm not making light of this, of course. I just more so just noting that the I guess fact that it's a term that if you're in educational circles you cannot get away from. As someone who consults to public schools quite a bit, I hear the word trauma. We need trauma-informed care, or this person needs a trauma-informed paraprofessional. I don't know what that is, quite honestly. And oftentimes, these kiddos are, kiddos with repertoires of challenging behaviors, and they have the alphabet soup of emotional behavioral disorder, diagnoses and things, ADHD, ODD, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I've got a ton of listener questions, but I guess my first kind of general question as behavior analysts, how should we conceptualize the whole notion of trauma? Firstly, and how does that relate to working with students with trauma histories, particularly in public school settings?
So, I think I probably have the same thoughts as you do about trauma. I sort of feel like I'm getting steamrolled with it. I'm working in a residential program. I'm working in a behavioral health organization that has residential programs, that has treatment foster care, that serves students in the community. So several years ago, there was, and it continues on. There's a lot of talk about trauma, and are we addressing trauma? Are the practices that we're using, are they trauma-informed practices? So that comes up a lot in the public school work that we're doing. That I would say over the past couple of years, that has also been pretty prevalent. The talk about trauma. And then I also run an internship program, a doctoral internship program in psychology. And of course, the interns are all concerned about trauma. So I kind of had to figure this out because my worldview is a behavior analytic view. So that's how I see things. That's how I see everything. And I had to fit that framework, that behavior analytic framework, fit trauma into that behavior analytic framework that I utilize when I look at things, when I do the work that I do, and kind of figure out, okay, where does this fit for me? How am I going to, how am I addressing this? So it's been interesting. Actually even had a little conversation with Pat Fryman out of Boys Town when this approach started to, when he started to talk about or have people at Boys Town start to talk about trauma-informed care and trauma. And I was trying to figure out how he was thinking about this. So you're right in that it is everywhere. Here's what we know. Here's what I know about trauma. And I've talked to a couple of people who do research in this area, one being Edna Foa. We had her here at Devereaux about 2 years ago. She's out of the University of Pennsylvania. She has a model for addressing trauma with adolescents called prolonged exposure. And then the other person who a lot of people in the behavioral healthcare field know about is Judith Cohen. Judith Cohen was also here as a presenter within Devereaux. And Judith Cohen utilizes or developed the model trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, TFCBT. And those are two evidence-based practices that are used with children and adolescents who are suffering from trauma exposure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma first of all. So trauma in itself is not a diagnosis. I'm not traumatized. I don't have trauma. Trauma is an event. So when we talk about trauma, that's the event. That's the thing that happened. Okay. And that thing that happened can be actual, or it can be a threat. It probably has to do with some kind of serious injury or some kind of sexual violation, and the person may be exposed to the event over and over again, or it may have happened just one time. So when we talk about trauma, first of all, let's recognize the fact that trauma is the event. Edna Foa will talk about the fact that she doesn't treat children and adolescents because they have experienced trauma, just because they have experienced trauma. She does not. Okay, you've got to meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And meeting that criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder means that there are certain things that you do. You may have some avoidance symptoms. You may have some cognition or mood symptoms. You may be aroused and pretty quickly, or have some reactivity. Maybe be a little more irritable, a little aggressive. So you got to meet that diagnosis. Basically, that's what she's saying, is you've got to, before she'll even treat someone with trauma. The other thing that's important, I think, and this is really important, I think, for people to understand, because a child is exposed to trauma, exposed to an event, does not mean that he or she needs trauma treatment. So that's really important to think about, because if you listen to everybody today in schools and in other programs that provide intervention for kids, they will say, if the child is exposed to trauma, they need treatment. That's not the case. Okay? A lot of us get exposed to traumatic events. And in fact, the kids that we work with here at the Center for Effective Schools, because most of our kids are in urban environments, they see lots of things. And they are exposed to a lot of events. It doesn't mean that they have post-traumatic stress disorder or that they are suffering. In a lot of cases, kids may see a serious thing happen, or maybe something happened to them, and they'll be affected for a little while, maybe for a week or so, a couple weeks, and then they kind of move on. They kind of get over it. And I think we have to recognize that that happens. That's what Edna Foa will say, and that's why she doesn't go into a treatment program with kids just because they've had exposure to an event.
Do you get pushback on that notion? If you're at a team meeting and you say, well, he or she may have had a traumatic event, but they're not exhibiting signs of PTSD, and therefore, they don't need specific trauma treatment. They need a behavioral intervention plan. And then, how do you do that without looking like a knuckle-dragging behaviorist, I guess is what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So I don't think I would normally say that.
Of course.
The very beginning.
There's probably a much better way to say it than I just blurted it out. But I'm just trying to figure out how do you communicate that effectively without looking like a kook.
Well, here's what happened to me. So I've had this experience. So I'm getting, I'm reading a little bit I'm reading about trauma, but I'm also getting exposed to people who are doing the research in this area, like Judith Cohen and Edna Foa, right? And I'm asking them questions and trying to find out from them and kind of figuring out from them what's going on. Judith Cohen actually said, you are not going to treat a behavior problem with trauma-focused intervention. You're not going to treat a behavior. If the kid has a behavior problem, you've got to have a behavior support plan. And I said, yep, that's right. That's exactly what we think. Just because a kid has problem behavior does not mean that problem behavior is due to a traumatic event that occurred in their past. And I think in many cases, we encounter people who believe that. That's their belief system. That's what they think is happening. But we know that we have to treat that problem behavior, because if we don't treat that problem behavior, that behavior is going to get worse. We're just probably within that environment shaping that behavior to become worse. And so we've got to treat it like a problem behavior. So a couple of years ago, I was in a school district where I got called in and I don't usually work with this school district, and my colleague called me and said, look, I do a lot of consulting around for autism in this district, but I'm calling you because they have a kid with some problem behavior, and he's basically running the school at this point. And he said they don't want to touch him because they think he has, in their words, trauma, that he's been traumatized. He said, do you think you want to do anything with it? And I said, all right, I don't know. Let me go down and take a look. Let me meet with him. So I took one of my postdoctoral students or postdoctoral fellows with me, and this was going to be his case. And we went down, and it was, sort of the typical thing that you get called into. You got a parent who is at odds with the school district. You've got an advocate in there who is pushing for, specialized placement, et cetera, et cetera. And basically, the district saying, the parent is telling me this kid has really a background of trauma. He's been abused, and that we can't touch him. We can't do anything. We can't put any consequences in effect because you're going to re-traumatize him. We're afraid of that. That's what the school district is saying. We're afraid we're going to re-traumatize him. So essentially, they weren't doing anything. Essentially, what this kid was doing was walking out of school, and he was a young kid, and they would just follow him. Nobody would touch him. They'd try to bring him back, and occasionally they would try to bring him back, and they'd end up in restraint, but they didn't want to do that. So we, basically, my approach in that meeting, after we did we did a functional behavioral assessment, and got some data, kind of felt that this was an attention function, that this was serving an attention function. Kid was roaming all over the school, had people following him. He would roam around the classroom. And we came back into the meeting and basically said, look, we've got this behavior problem. If we don't take care of this, it's just going to get worse. We need to treat it as a behavior problem. Now, there may be trauma here. We did not do a trauma assessment. If you think there's trauma here, then I would take him somewhere to meet with a therapist to do maybe some assessment of trauma, and if he needs it, then give him a treatment, like a trauma-focused treatment. But what we know is that he's got a behavior problem, and if we don't address that behavior problem, it's going to get worse. So that's sort of how we have addressed it. We did address the behavior problem. It didn't get worse. We did a nice job, and that sort of was the end of it.
Okay, so it's pretty much you treated the behavior as, it's funny because I was just this morning, there was some discussion about trauma on one of the ABA Facebook pages, and people were saying, well, behavior's behavior, and other, all these, kind of, but people kind of piling on with all these different perspectives and viewpoints and things like that. But it sounds like, if you look at the basic fundamentals that are reinforcing problematic behavior, and
you have to address it.
Yeah. So if I can just kind of, so in order to, I guess, attend to the concerns of trauma, you would basically recommend that the student gets, perhaps referred for some sort of assessment, and if necessary, some sort of treatment, but that at the same time, a behavioral intervention can proceed more or less without delay.
Yeah, I think that you can do that. I think you have to be careful in doing that. I think if you're going to address the behavior as a behavior analyst, there's some things that you need to be aware of. First of all, given the fact that kids are exposed to lots of things today, if you're working in kind of the environments that we're working in, kids have been exposed to a lot. I think if you're going to develop a positive behavior support plan, if you're going to do a functional behavioral assessment and develop a positive behavior support plan, you've got to know that child's background. You do have to do a record review, a careful record review. You have to know what has happened to this child before you begin to intervene. there may be some exposure to trauma in his or her background, and you want to be aware of that. The reason to be aware of that is because as you're developing your prevention strategies, antecedent strategies, as you're developing your consequences to address the problem behavior, you want to make sure that you're not doing anything that might trigger some kind of trauma response, if there's going to be a trauma response. So I think you have to be careful in that way. You got to have a good history of the kid. I think, so what is, and this is what I struggle with, what is behavior that is elicited from trauma? Okay, so if a kid has a traumatic experience and as a result is having problem behavior in the classroom, what does that behavior look like? I think we're kind of talking. Are we not talking about more like respondent behavior at that point? And, shouldn't we be looking at it like that if that is the case? And so when if I'm going to be looking at kids with problem behavior in the classroom, I want to make sure that we're talking about operant behavior, that it is responsive to consequences, and that we can put, with both types of behavior, antecedent intervention is going to be helpful. But will this behavior respond to consequences? Am I dealing with operant behavior? If that's the case, then I'm going to go in and intervene.
As you're saying that, I'm wondering, like, if perhaps a test for that would be, one's response to a functional analysis. In other words, if you can kind of turn on and shut off the behavior by the presentation and removal of specific antecedent consequent pairs, then it would pretty much confirm that you're looking at operant behavior and not some other process. And perhaps if one did that with precursor type to the terminal behavior, you could do that in a way that is that presents less risk to the child. So that's a very interesting point. I never thought about it like that. So that you brought up. Well, I think that story in and of itself, Barry, addressed like the half a dozen or so questions I had here on trauma. So I think that was really, really helpful. So, is there a book or some article or set of articles that you could think of that would give a behavior analyst some sort of background on how to better conceptualize these sorts of things? I mean, I've got some things that I'll run down for the show notes, like some of the research, like Edna Foa and Judith Cohen, and I'll try to get that stuff in the show notes and get some literature from them. But if there's any other resource that you can think of, if you can't think of one right now and you think of one later, just let me know, and we'll certainly get that in the show notes for today's episode.
I mean, I don't think we have anything that's out there specifically for behavior analysts. There needs to be something so that we can put this idea, we can within our own frame of reference, so we can think about it better. I think that we do need that resource. I mean, the treatment for trauma is exposure therapy. I mean, that's what it's going to be. And in trauma-focused CBT, it's exposure therapy. And in prolonged exposure, I mean, that's what it is. It's exposure therapy. These are behavioral approaches. And we do a lot of other kind of cognitive behavioral approaches around that exposure, but that's essentially it's a behavioral intervention. It's exposure.
Do you folks either in looking at trauma or otherwise, when you start talking about CBT, it made me think of ACT. Are you guys where is ACT on your radar screen?
Right there. I just got back from the boot camp. I was at the ACT boot camp in Baltimore in October.
Oh, nice.
So I didn't just get back, but I'm very interested in ACT. I'm very interested in students in special education, students in special ed for behavior disorders. I'm very interested in introducing it with that population. I think Mark Dixon has done that, and I want to look a little bit at his work and see what he's done. But that's my interest area. That's my interest in ACT. That's the reason for my interest in ACT.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, the Accept, Identify, and Move is the curriculum that is...
Right, the AIM curriculum.
He's got 2 curricula out, and the AIM is the most recent one. And,
right.
There's a lot of daily ACT lessons. I'm starting to implement some of the daily ACT lessons with some of the programs I'm working with. So
good.
I'm looking forward to seeing how that. It's the long game, and that's the thing that's a little challenging for is that you want, you have to have the kind of more direct behavioral contingency management going alongside the teaching kids about present moment awareness and diffusion and things like that. So how was I didn't know you were going to bring this up, but how was the boot camp?
It was great, actually. There were a lot of people there, and I took 2 of my staff along with me, so 3 of us went, and it's just it was really good. I feel like personally, I really have to understand RFT, relational frame theory. So I've been doing a lot of reading about that. I don't like to talk about ACT unless I'm talking about RFT, so I can sort of better understand the process of change. That's what I feel like I need to do, and I feel like I need to understand RFT to understand that process of change, that transformation of stimulus function. It was great, but I still came back with feeling like I needed to know more. So I'm doing some reading now.
Great.
Specifically on RFT.
Well, Praxis has been a sponsor of the podcast, and so we like the work that they do, and they've got another boot camp coming up here in Reno in a little bit. So
yeah, it was really good. I would encourage people to go if you want to learn about ACT. It was a great way to learn.
Very cool. All right, so I think we're coming up on some time restrictions here. And I want to be respectful of your day. So let's wrap up with a couple more questions. So Barry, what advice would you give to a newly minted BCBA, or in your context, being a program for school psychologists, a newly minted school psychologist, or whatever combination of both that you might run across?
Well, I'm going to talk about newly minted BCBAs, okay? Because I have a lot of my folks who are also, my employees are, several of them are BCBAs, and several of them are in the process of becoming BCBAs. And my interns, a lot of my interns are in the process of becoming BCBAs. I mean, I guess I would say don't be afraid to work outside the box. I think behavior analysis has become sort of the science of the behavior of individuals with autism, or the science of the behavior of individuals with IDD. I don't look at it that way. Behavior analysis is a science of behavior. And I think we need to remember that, because there's always seems to be such a reluctance to use a behavior analytic approach with other populations. So I would say don't be afraid to work outside the box. I think that's what we do here at the Center for Effective Schools. We apply those principles to working with children and adolescents with behavior disorders. So it's a bit of a stretch sometimes, because there are other modalities that you're involved with. But I think behavior analysts bring to the table certain skills that can be useful, really useful. The emphasis on data collection, direct observation, use of single case design to evaluate what's going on. All of that stuff I think is good and can be used in other settings. It doesn't have to just be used in working with kids with autism or children and adults with autism, or children and adults with developmental disabilities.
Great. All right. And then lastly, if people are interested in learning more about CES or Devereaux in general, where can they go for more information?
So we have a website that we're just in the process of changing. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks it'll be changed. It's the www.centerforeffectiveschools, effective, all one word, .org. Or they can go to the Devereaux website, www.devereaux.org, and find the link on there.
Great. And I'll have that in the notes from today's episode. All right. This has been a very informative conversation. I'm so glad we made time for it. So, Dr. Barry McCurdy, really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciated being here. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.